Hello and welcome back to this basic biblical Greek course. We are looking at lesson 14 today. And I'm really excited about today's lesson as we're going to be starting with the aorist indicatives. But as you can also see, we've got a lot of ground to cover today. So we're going to start with the aorist indicative and do an overview. Thereafter, we'll look at the first aorist active and middle indicative forms. Afterwards, we will learn about the first aorist first passive indicative forms. And then second to last, we'll do the future passive indicatives together. And then finally, we'll do some vocabulary and translation work. And due to the amount of content that we have to get through today, we won't do as much translation work as usual. And if you don't mind, I'll do some extra time with translation work in the next lesson. But if you're ready, let's get going. So as I ease you into the Greek aorist tense forms, I thought it'd be good to compare it with the English counterpart first. So there are two different ways to form the past tense in English. The first way is what we can call the regular way, and that is to just add a D or an ED to the end of the word. So for example, with save, we add the D to make it past tense, saved. And with help, we add the ed to make it past tense, helped. Right, so that's regular. The second way of forming the past tense is what we may call the irregular. And it's irregular because we have to change the spelling of the stem. So for example, we have buy, and the past tense that becomes bought. We have run, and the past tense that becomes ran. And eating, in the past tense becomes ate. Right, so the difference between the regular and the irregular is that the irregular requires the stem to undergo a spelling change. And with that background in mind, this is similar to Greek. All right, so there are two ways to form the aorist tense in Greek. The first way is the regular, which we can call the first aorist. And just like we added the D in English, we are going to add the sigma alpha in the Greek to form the first aorist. And most Greek verbs will follow this pattern. And in this lesson, we only will look at the first aorist, and then in the following lesson, lesson 15, we will talk more about the second aorist. And the second aorist falls under the irregular way of forming the past tense in Greek. All right, it's a second aorist, and that will require a stem change, just like in English. So seeing that we are learning a new tense form today, it will be good to do some quick revision of aspect and tense. So just to remind you, verbal aspect, the definition that we've been using in this course, is the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author communicates the action of a given verb. Right, so that's the verbal aspect. And so far, we have covered three tense forms. We've learned the present, the imperfect, and the future. And today we're going to be covering the aorist tense forms. And as you can see here, the aorist tense forms conveys an action that takes place in the past. And because we are still working in the indicative mood, the past time is still significant. So in this course, we've also looked at different types of verbal aspect. The first one that we learned was the imperfective verbal aspect, which consists of the present and imperfect tense forms. The second verbal aspect is the perfective, which consists of the future, and as we will see today, also the aorist tense forms. and then the states of which we haven't looked at yet, which consists of the perfect and pluperfect tense forms. All right, so we are focusing today on the perfective verbal aspect. What I'd like to do in this slide and the one following is just set the context for our lesson today. So the first point here is just an overview of what the aorist tense forms and perfective verbal aspect are. So it says there, the aorist tense form or perfective aspect is used when the author wants to portray the action in its entirety or as a whole. So we'll speak more about that in the next slide. And when would you expect to see the aorist tense in the Greek? What says there? It often carries the main story of the narrative, whereas the present and imperfect tense forms are used to introduce significant characters, background information, or to emphasize certain features of a story. So if you read the gospel accounts, which are the narratives of the life of Jesus, you will see that the gospel writers will primarily work with the aorist tense forms, almost like the default tense. And when they diverge from the aorist and they use the present and imperfect tense forms, they are drawing our attention to significant characters or background information or certain features of the story which they think are important for us to be mindful of as we are reading that account. So in the previous slide, we saw that the aorist tense form is used to present the action as a whole or in its entirety. So let me give you a quick example here, and I hope I don't confuse you by this, but just to give you some food for thought. Romans 5 verse 4, Paul writes, "Death reigned from Adam to Moses." And in the Greek, reigned is ebasilusen, and Paul uses the aorist tense form to communicate the action of that verb. And why is he using the aorist? Well, Paul's reason for using the aorist tense was not to communicate a once for all action or a punctiliar type of action. In other words, death reigned and it's finished in Klar. It's done with. No, that wasn't his intention. His intention rather was to focus on the action as a whole without detailing how it actually unfolded in history. All right, so he's really just giving us the big picture summary or viewpoint of death and telling us that it reigned from Adam to Moses. All right, let's turn our attention now to the first aorist active indicative and look at the components or the building blocks of this tense form. So firstly, it has an augment, and if you remember from the imperfect, the first aorist is augmented just like the imperfect to show past action. The next component, the tense form, the first aorist tense stem is generally the same form as the present tense stem. All right, so we're going to use luo as our pattern again. The next component is the tense formative, in the same way that the future tense added a tense formative, which was the sigma. So the first aorist also adds a tense formative between the stem and the personal endings. This time the tense formative is the sigma alpha. And then the last component of the personal endings. The first aorist active indicative uses secondary endings because it is also augmented. Right, so let's have a look at a visual of these components now. All right, so the first component of the first aorist active is the augment. All right, and if the verb begins with a consonant, which it does here with our example of lu, then we are going to use the epsilon. The tense stem is going to be LU once again. The tense formative is the sigma alpha. And then the first aorist active takes secondary active personal endings. Now, I will remind you of those endings in the next slide. Just want you to pay attention to this comment. Notice that there are no connecting vowels. Why is that? Well, the tense formative, the sigma alpha, the alpha is a vowel, and therefore a connecting vowel is unnecessary. All right, so that's why there are no connecting vowels in the first aorist active. Let us now take a look at the first aorist active endings with LU. And before we do that, on the right hand side, I have given you a visual of the secondary active endings. The singular, if you remember, the first person is a nu, second person sigma, the third person does not have an ending. The plural endings were men, te, and nu. Right, so those are quite apparent now in our first aorist active endings. Let's have a look at them together. The singular first. We have here elu sa. All right, there's just a note at the bottom here. It says no ending is used for the first person singular. So although it's normally, the ending is normally a nu, this one's going to follow the no ending. So we simply are going to attach the tense formative, the sigma alpha. So we have elu sa. Second person singular is elu sas. Third person singular is elu se with a movable nu. There's another comment here to pay attention to. No ending is used for the third person singular, but the alpha of the sigma alpha is changed to an epsilon. Right, so that's why there's no alpha there, but we have the epsilon instead. So it's elu se with a movable nu. And then the plural forms are quite straightforward. First person plural is elu sa men. The second person plural is elu sa te. And the third person plural is elu san. So let me go through those with you one more time. The singulars, we have elu sa. Second person, elu sas. Third person, elu se. The plural, first person, elu sa men. Second person, elu sa te. And third person, elu san. So regarding the translation of the first aorist active indicative, remember we are working with the perfective verbal aspect, and that's essentially where the author or speaker is looking at the action as a whole or in its entirety. So remember the example of Romans 5 verse 4, where Paul says that from Adam to Moses, what happened? Well, death reigned. All right, so Paul was looking at the action as a whole. So when we translate this, we translate it with a simple English past, which conveys a whole or entire action, i.e. not focusing on its beginning, progression, culmination, or results. So let's go through the forms again very quickly. So we have elu sa, elu sas, elu se, in the plural, elu sa men, elu sa te, and elu san. So the way that we would translate the first aorist active indicative, the first person singular, elu sa, we would translate as I loosed. The second person singular, elu sas, we would translate as you loosed. The third person singular, elu se, we would translate as he, she, or it loosed. And then the plural, we have elu sa men, which we would render as we loosed. The second person plural, elu sa te, you loosed. And finally, the third person plural, elu san, they loosed. All right, so we translate it as a simple past action. So some of you at this point might want to reach for the screen and throttle me by the neck. because you thought we were done and dusted with amalgamation, but unfortunately it has returned its ugly head. So what was true in the future tense is also true in the first aorist active. Why? Because of the sigma. So when the stem of a verb ends with a consonant, that consonant combines with the sigma of the first aorist to form a different letter. In other words, amalgamation. So let me just remind you of the different types of amalgamation that can take place. We have the labials, which are the P, the beta, and the phi, plus the sigma changes to a psi. The velars are your kappa, gamma, and chi, plus the sigma changes to a xi. And the dentals are the tau, the delta, the theta, and the zeta, plus the sigma amalgamates and remains as a sigma. So let's look at one or two examples together. So here are some amalgamation examples in the aorist tense. The first one is baptizo. In the first aorist active, it's going to become e baptisa, right? Because the zeta has amalgamated with the sigma, and we end up with sigma. So that's why it is e baptisa. The next one is blepo, and that becomes e blepsa, right? Because that's the labial, the P plus the sigma have amalgamated to form the psi. So now we have e blepsa. The third example is didasco, and that becomes e didaxa. All right, so what has happened there? The kappa has amalgamated with the sigma of the first aorist and become the xi. So that's why we have e didaxa. And the last example is sozo, where once again the zeta plus the sigma have amalgamated and we end up with esosa. All right, we're making good progress here. Let's move on to the first aorist middle forms and look at the components first. So once again, we have the augment, which is the epsilon. The tense stem is lu. The tense formative is a sigma alpha. And the middle is going to take the secondary middle personal endings, which I will remind you of shortly. So just two comments here. Notice that there are no connecting vowels again, because the tense formative ends in a vowel. And then the last comment, the first aorist has distinct middle and passive voices. Right, so the middle forms are different from the passive forms. So let's take a look at the first aorist middle endings with luo. But before we do that, let me remind you of the secondary middle personal endings. The singular, we have main, then we have so, and the third person singular is ta. The plural endings are metha, iste, and nta. All right, and these are quite easy to see in the first aorist middle. The only real change is the second person singular, and I've got an explanation here for this. All right, remember that the true ending for the second person singular is so, okay, as you can see here. However, the sigma could not stand between the two vowels, the alpha and the omicron. All right, so so plus so, all right, ends up with sigma alpha omicron, and the alpha and the omicron contract to form the omega, so we're left with so. So that's why our ending here is so. Other than that, it's quite straightforward. So let's go through them together. The first person singular is elusa main. Second person singular is elu so. Third person singular is elu sa ta. The first person plural is elu sa metha. The second person plural is elu saste. And then the third person plural is elu san ta. All right, some features here. Remember to place the augment in the front, which shows that it's a past action. Also be mindful of the tense formative, which is the sigma alpha, which is present in all of them except the second person singular. And then all you're left with is the secondary middle personal endings, the main, the ta, the metha, the ista, and the inta. All right, so let's go through those one more time. The singulars, elu sa main. Second person singular, elu so. Third person singular, elu sa ta. First person plural, elu sa metha. Second person plural, elu saste. And then the third person plural, elu san ta. So how would we translate the first aorist middle indicative verbs? All right, elu sa main, we would translate as I loosed for myself. Remember that the middle voice is where the subject acts in its own interest or for itself. So that's why we add those additional words, for myself. And then elu so, we would translate as you loosed for yourself. And then elu sa ta, we would render as he, she, it loosed for himself. Then the plural forms, elu sa metha, we would translate as we loosed for ourselves. Elu saste, we would render this as you loosed for yourselves. And then finally, elu san ta, we would translate as they loosed for themselves.
Take the secondary endings you've known all along. Put a saw in front of them before you stick them on. Take an epsilon, stick it to the front of the word. And that's how you get the aorist active and middle verb. Yeah, but you gotta know there's an exception. Exceptions to this rule are in the active voice. Sticking to the rules would give you too much choice. So first person singular doesn't use the new. And third person singular uses set instead of saw.
It's now time to learn the first aorist first passive components. And first implies that there are also first aorist second passive components, and we will deal with those in lesson 15. But we're focusing now on the first passive. So what are the components or building blocks of this form? Well, the first one is that we have an augment once again, which shows that the action takes place in the past. The tense stem is lu once again. And then the tense formative is no longer sigma alpha. It is now theta eta. And then the personal endings. The first passive takes secondary active personal endings. So this comment here, I just want to reinforce this. Notice that the passive takes active endings. So whereas the first aorist middle components or forms took secondary middle personal endings, the first passive takes active endings, just like the first aorist active forms. And then a final note here, because theta eta ends in a vowel, a connecting vowel is not needed. Now that you are familiar with the first aorist first passive components, Let's take a look at the forms now with LU. Remember that the first passive takes secondary active endings. So let me just remind you of those. The singular endings are new, the second person singular, sigma, the third person does not have an ending. The plural are men, te, and new. Just regarding the third person plural, just got a comment here. Notice that the third person plural takes the longer son rather than the short new. All right, so have a look at the third person plural there. We've got the sigma, alpha, and new, instead of simply just having the new. So you can recognize the augment at the front of the stem, showing you the past action. And then we have the stem lu. And then the most significant change that has occurred in the first passive is we have the tense formative, the theta eta, not the sigma alpha. And then we simply have the secondary active endings that are attached at the end. All right, so let's go through these forms together. The singular, first person, we have elu thein. Second person singular, elu theis. Third person singular, elu thei. First person plural, elu thei men. Second person plural, elu thei te. And third person plural, elu thei son. Once again, very quickly, elu thein, elu theis, elu thei. Plural forms, elu thei men, elu thei te, and elu thei son. Let us now learn how we are going to translate the first aorist, first passive indicative. The first thing to keep in mind is that we are dealing with the first aorist, so this is the aorist tense form, or if you like to think of it as the perfective verbal aspect. So this is looking at an action that was done at the past, but looking at it as a whole or in its entirety. And then we're also looking at the passive voice. Remember, the passive voice is when the subject receives the action of the verb, or in other words, the action is done to the subject. So in the first example there, we have elu thein, and we would translate that as I was loosed. So you could think of this as saying I was loosed, and then add in the words by, it'll be some external agent that would have done the action to the subject, to I. All right, so we have elu thein, which is I was loosed. The second person singular, elu theist, you were loosed. Third person singular, elu thei, he or she, it was loosed. The plural forms, we have elu thei men, we were loosed. Second person plural, elu thei te, you were loosed. And then the third person plural, elu thei son, they were loosed. Before we move on to the future passive forms, there is one exception that I want to make you aware of, and this has to do with stems ending in a consonant. So take a look here with me. Some final verb consonants are altered or changed when they are followed by a theta. Now, you need to be aware that these are not amalgamations because the final consonants are not actually combining with the theta eta. So let's do one or two examples together to show you what is meant by these definitions and terms. So the first one is labials, which are either the P or the beta. When those two consonants come before a theta, you then have the additional phi before the theta. So look at the example here. We have lapo, And then if we had to put that into the first aorist first passive, that becomes leif thein. Right, so that we have the phi that comes before the theta eta. All right, let's have a look at the next one, the velars, which are the kappa and the gamma. When those come before the theta, we then have the additional key in front of the theta. So the example there is ago, and that becomes eik thein. All right, so you can see the key there before the theta, and then you should be able to recognize the tense formative, the theta eta. And then lastly, we have the dentals, which are the tau, the delta, the zeta, or the theta. If those consonants come before the theta, then we have the additional sigma, which is added. So the example there is baptizo, and that becomes baptistein, with the sigma which is added there before the theta eta. Right, so this is slightly technical, but I just want you to be aware of this, and hopefully in time we'll do more examples together and you'll become more familiar with this rule. Okay, if you are tuned into what we're doing in this lesson, you might be very surprised to see that we are moving from the aorist tense form to the future tense form. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you now in a few seconds. But firstly, if you remember in lesson 7, I introduced you to the future tense forms, and there we looked at the future active indicative forms and the future middle indicative forms. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to just do some quick revision specifically of the future middle indicative forms, because like me, you might have forgotten them. So let's just reinforce the learning that we did in lesson 7. So the singular forms, we have lusomai, second person singular, lusei, third person singular, lusetai. The plural forms, lusometha, second person plural, lusesthe, and third person plural, lusontai. Remember that the future tense form is characterized by the tense formative, the sigma. All right, so the sigma tells us that it's the future tense form. And as you can see here, the future middle indicative takes primary middle personal endings, which are the amai, the a, the etai, ametha, esthe, and ontai. And that's including the connecting vowels as well. So let me go through those with you quickly once more. First person singular, lusomai. Second person singular, lusei. Third person singular, lusetai. First person plural, lusometha. Second person plural, lusesthe. And third person plural, lusontai. All right, I'm sure you're ready to find out why we're doing the future tense form with the first aorist. So let me show you why now. Okay, so the answer is the future passive forms are derived from the unaugmented stem of the first aorist first passive. In other words, in layman's terms, the future passive forms are very similar to the first aorist first passive forms. Let's have a look at the components here first. Firstly, as you can see that there is no augment, all right, because this is the future tense. We're not looking at the past tense. The future tense tells us about an action that will happen in a future time period. Then the tense stem is lu once again. And have a look here, the tense formative. All right, now you will recognize the sigma, all right, which tells us that it's future, but the future passive also has a theta eta. Right, now that you've learned the first aorist, first passive, and that is characterized by the theta eta, you can now see why we're doing the future passive components in this lesson and why we didn't do it previously in lesson 7. And then we have the return of connecting vowels, either the omicron or the epsilon. And why is that? It's because the future tense forms takes primary middle passive personal endings. Right, so let's just go through this quickly. Notice that the future passive takes primary middle passive endings. So we're moving away now from the secondary endings, which are actions that are taking place in the past. Primary endings tell us about actions in the present or the future. And then we have the sigma, which is added to convey the future tense form again. And we have the return of the connecting vowel. All right, so let's have a look at the future passive forms now together. So before we go through the future passive forms with LUO again, let's just make some observations very quickly. All right, so our stem is LU. Remember, there's no augment because we're looking at the future tense. And then you should be able to recognize the theta eta sigma, which is the key to recognizing the future passive. And then we have the primary middle passive endings with the connecting vowels, either the omicron or the epsilon. So let's go through them together. The singular first person is luthesomai. Second person singular, luthesei. Third person singular, luthesetai. First person plural, luthesometha. Second person plural, lutheseste. And third person plural, luthesontai. So let me say this for you one more time. The singular, we have luthesomai, luthesei, luthesetai. The plural forms, luthesometha, lutheseste, and then finally luthesontai. Let us now have a look at the translation of the future passive indicative. So keep in mind that the future tense form tells us about an action that is yet to occur. It will happen sometime in the future. And because it's the passive voice, remember the passive voice is where the subject receives the action of the verb, or there's a outside agent that is going to do the action to the subject. And because of that idea, we're going to add the helping word be to show the passive voice. And then we have the standard I will to indicate, or should I just say will, to indicate the future action. All right, so let's go through the translation of these. Luthesomai, we would translate as I will be loosed. Then luthesei, you will be loosed. Luthesetai, he or she or it will be loosed. Luthesometha, we will be loosed. Lutheseste, you will be loosed. Luthesontai, they will be loosed. And when we spoke about the translation of the first aorist, first passive, I said to you, you can think of it as the action being done to it. So it's I will be loosed by an external agent. And you can add that to all the various forms. Let me finish with a summary of the forms that we've covered in this lesson. So the future middle, the formative was the sigma, and the endings were the primary middle passive personal endings. Then we had a look at the first aorist, first passive, and the tense formative there was the theta eta. and the endings were the secondary active personal endings. And then finally, we looked at the future passive, and the tense formative is the theta, eta, sigma, and they take primary middle passive personal endings.
You are a theta, you are an eta. You alert me to a passive form. Only aorist and future tenses have unique passive forms. Now aorist passive is like other aorist. It takes an epsilon before the stem, and its endings are secondary, but theta, eta come right before them. Now future passive is like other futures, with primary endings and sigma before. But before you attach that to the stem, that theta, eta will sit right before. Now there are some passives that are bewildering, because some thetas don't stick around. It is confusing, but don't you worry, etas and sigmas may still be found. You are a theta, and you are an eta. You alert me to a passive form. Only aorist and future tenses have unique passive forms.
Let us take a look at our vocabulary for lesson 14. The first word is hamarteno. Notice the rough breathing mark, hamarteno, which means I sin. Then we have aneir, andros ha, aneir, andros ha. So it's a third declension noun, giving us the nominative and gender forms, and that means man or husband. Then we have gunei, guneikos he, gunei, guneikos he, which means woman or wife. Then we have a deponent verb, dekamai, dekamai, which means I receive. Next we have dekaya sune he, dekaya sune he, which means righteousness. Next we have dunamis, dunamaeos he, dunamis, dunamaeos he, which is power. Then we have eirene he, eirene he, which is peace. Then we have an adjective, kakos, kake, kakon, kakos, kake, kakon, which is bad or evil. Then we have keruso, keruso, which is I preach or I proclaim. Then we have oikos, ha, which means house. Then we have pistis, pisteos he, pistis, pisteos he, which is faith. And our last verb, pharaoh, pharaoh, which means I bear or I carry. Right, let's look at our first translation exercise for today. The Greek reads, ta euangelion ha a kuste hupa tu andros lambanatai hupa tes gunaikos autu. So what I'd like to do when I translate verses is to look for the subject, the verb, and the complement first. So let's do that very quickly. The subject will always be in the nominative case. So ta euangelion is our subject. The verb is akous the, and then the rest of the sentence would be our complement. Right, so identify the subject, the verb, and the complement first. So let's translate this verse together, and then I'll make some observations as we go along. So Tayu Gelion, our subject, is translated as the gospel, or the good news, and then we have a relative pronoun, which is also in the nominative case, so that refers back to the gospel, and because gospel is not a living thing, we're not going to say the gospel who, so we would use the English which or that. So I'll use which. The gospel which. Akous the is our verb, so let's pass that together. It's a first aorist. How do we know that? Well, we can see the lengthened augment, the eta at the front, and it's a first passive. So I hope you can recognize the tense formative, the theta eta, which tells you this is a passive voice. Its case is indicative, it's a third person singular, and the vocab is here. So how do we translate the first aorist, first passive? It's the gospel which was heard. And as I told you previously, the passive voice is when the action is done to it, so it's going to be done by something else. So it's by hupa, the preposition, to andros. Andros is a noun, genitive, masculine, singular. It could mean man, but I'm going to translate it as husband. Heard by the husband. Lambanatai is a verb. It's a present. It can be middle or passive, but I think the context best suits the passive voice. Indicative, third person singular, and the vocab is receive. By the husband is the present tense, being received, conveying the passive voice. Hupa is once again translated as by whom. Tais gunaikos atu. Gunaikos is a noun, genitive, feminine, singular, and it's translated as wife. Is being received by atu, his wife. Okay, so it's the gospel which was heard by the husband is being received by his wife. Let's do our second translation example together. The Greek reads, hoi logoi tes pistuos hoi ke ruch thesontai en to hero akous thesontai eke hup andron kai gunaikon. So once again, we look for the subject, the verb, and the complement. So here we have the subject, which is in the nominative case, hoi logoi, but it also includes tes pistuos, so that together would be our subject. And then our main verb is ke ruch thesontai, and then the rest of the sentence would be the complement. So let's do the translation together, and I'll make some observations once again as we go along. So hoi logoi is in the nominative case, it's masculine and it's plural. So the vocab is word, so it's the words. Tes pistuos, the words genitive of faith. And if you're not too sure about that, I've done the past in below here. It's a noun, genitive, feminine, singular, and the vocab is faith. So the words of faith, and then we have a relative pronoun in the nominative case, so it refers back to the words of faith. So the words of faith, which or that, and then we have our main verb, ke ruch thesontai. So let's pass that together. It's a verb and it's future. Well, how do we know that? All right, look at the tense formative, the theta, eta, sigma. It's a future passive, as we've learned in this lesson. Indicative, third person plural, and it can mean preach or proclaim. I'm going to use proclaim here. So the words of faith which will be proclaimed, excuse my handwriting, proclaimed. And then we have in to hero, all right, in the temple. Our next verb, akous theisontai, which is very similar to the previous one, is also a future passive indicative third person plural, and the vocab is here. In the temple will be heard. Eke, there, hoop, by whom? Andron, by husbands, kai, and gunaikon, wives. Okay, so the words of faith which will be proclaimed in the temple will be heard there by husbands and wives.